Hannibal, our travel agent, had suggested a few day trips that would give us a chance to see some other aspects of Chile. The first two would be based out of Puerto Varas. We would then fly up to Santiago, where we would have another 2 expeditions before flying home. The classical volcano shape of Osorno dominates the view from Puerto Varas. We were due to visit it on the 2nd day of our stay here. Our first trip was by coach to the island of Chiloe. Initially, the coach retraced our steps from the previous evening back through Puerto Montt and then on southwards towards the ferry crossing for Chiloe. The crossing itself was interesting, partially because of the wide variety of ferries operating on this short route, but also because the tide was flooding hard and there was a huge variety of wildlife chasing fish, including cormorants, seals, and pelicans. After landing, the bus made its way the short distance from the landing stage to the little town of Ancud, where there was a fortress built to keep the British out. This useful relief map of the island of Chiloe was in the town museum, with north to the left. In total, the island is about 100 kilometers long. There were a number of other fascinating maritime exhibits in the museum. The bus then made its way southwards to the little fishing village of Dalcahué. We happened to arrive there on the day of the festival celebrating the existence of Dalcahué for 120 years and experienced the local folk music. There were several fishing boats anchored off, and we saw the first of many examples of the local technique of building out over the water on piles. The local church was delightfully simple in its structure, with some quite beautiful details. Lunch was a short drive away at a new hotel, which was at the end of a narrow, twisty, and quite a long track. It was nevertheless a delightful meal in pleasant surroundings. The bus made its way up the twisty track and onto the main road before heading a little further south to Castro, the capital town of Chiloe. We were quite tired and did not venture much beyond the main square. We saw some further examples of local houses built almost entirely on piles over the water. The bus retraced its steps on the long journey back to the ferry. In the area around Puerto Montt, we saw some of the new subsidized housing with which the government is trying to attract people to come to work in the area. After Norway, Chile has the highest level of farmed salmon production in the world, and this is the main area for its production. Eventually, the bus returned to Puerto Varas and the view across the lake to Osorno. That evening we spent in company with our friends Mike and Rosemary and their son Alistair. They had first inspired us to make this trip and had arrived in Puerto Varas, having travelled across the Andes from Mendoza in Argentina. The next morning we would go our separate ways. After a fairly relaxing day in the town, we joined an afternoon trip to Osorno. As we neared the volcano, the cloud cleared from the top, and we managed to get some impressive views of the snow-covered peak. The bus wound its way up the mountain until it reached the ski lodge at a height of about 1,200 meters. We succumbed to the temptation to go on up in the chairlift, though neither of us had ever travelled on one before. Getting on to the moving chairlift proved quite an adventure for Dan, and on her first attempt she ended up in a heap lying across the attendant. He stopped the ski lift, put her into a chair. She successfully made the round trip. When she reached the bottom, he helped her off. Obviously they were great friends. I could do nothing except watch. We were lucky the cloud base was a few hundred feet above us, and the views across the lake were all that we had expected them to be. Back down the zigzag road and along the lakeside to the hotel. The cloud was now down on Osorno, so we had been lucky. The next day our flight to Santiago was in the late afternoon, so we sat in the park listening to Ramon, the panpipe player, whose playing is used for some of the incidental music on this video with his consent. Our lunch was at a small restaurant that one of the guides had advised us about. We had a full asado, which is a kind of barbecue meal. Far too large, but very good. We were taken to a little airfield just outside Puerto Montt to board the 1.5-hour flight to Santiago. It was getting dark as the taxi drove across the city to our hotel, but we could see that it was a bustling and modern city with some amazingly tall skyscrapers, particularly so when you consider that this is in an earthquake area. Our first trip from Santiago was to the classic coastal town of Valparaiso. We were hardly out of the city when we saw the massive copper mines still being worked. Nearly all the main roads in Chile are tolled and had been fairly recently built using Spanish finance. Just after an hour from Santiago, we crossed the Casablanca Valley, which the Chileans claim to be one of the best white wine growing areas in the world. Sadly, we did not stop there. Valparaiso turned out to be an incredible jumble of buildings piled one on top of the other and clinging by their fingernails to the steep hillsides. Our first stop was at the rather strange house of the Chilean poet and communist politician called Neruda. He is still widely revered in the country, and the house is almost a shrine to his memory. His poetry sounds rather strange to our ears.
Puedo escribir los versos más tristes esta noche. Yo la quise y a veces ella también me quiere.
The bus wound its way up and down the hills and through the business district near the centre of the town, where we saw this magnificent naval building. Valparaiso is the headquarters of the Chilean Navy. It is also a busy port. In total, there are 7 funicular railways to help the locals get to and from work and give the tourists a scare. Some parts of the town, like this one, have been designated as World Heritage Site. It was in this area that we had another pleasant Chilean lunch. After lunch, the bus went round the bay to the Benidorm-like Vina del Mar. It had a completely different atmosphere, so relaxed that even the sea lions seemed to enjoy it. For these trips from Santiago, Christian was our interpreter and guide, and Paulina was the driver. Both of them were especially attentive to Dan. As we were about to leave Vina del Mar, we were reminded by the existence of this local museum that Easter Island, way out in the Pacific, is a Chilean dependency. Sadly, we did not have time to inspect the museum. It was then a long haul back to Santiago for the night. Our second trip from Santiago travelled south for about 3 hours to the Colchagua Valley, which the Chileans claim to be among the best areas in the world for growing red wines, although they do tend to acknowledge that the Argentine Mendoza wines represent an extremely strong challenge. Once again, it was south along the toll roads. There are wayside stalls and extensive orchards as well as vineyards. Our first stop was at the Casa Silva vineyard, which has been established for many years. The owner's other passion is a collection of vintage cars. This was the first place that I encountered Carmenere wines, which are unique to Chile. After leaving Casa Silva, we made our way round the edge of San Fernando and on to the town of Santa Cruz, where we stopped for lunch. Once again, we had a magnificent meal, which included a beautifully cooked piece of Chilean steak. After lunch, we visited the local Museo Colchagua. This was stuffed full of local history and culture, but we were both tired and could not cope with more than a 1-hour visit. Most fascinating was a special exhibit that had been put together about the rescue of the 30 Chilean miners. We could have happily spent the day in that museum had we been fit enough. Another half-hour drive brought us to Vina Santa Cruz. This is a new winery very close to the Colchagua Valley, in which modern winemaking techniques are used. First, we went up their private funicular to get an overview of the area, sheltering ourselves from the sun in a house built in the style of the Mapuche Indians. During this tour, we learnt a lot about the distinction between ordinary Chilean wines and the Reserva wines. We now faced the long drive back to Santiago. Interesting, but quite a strain for Paulina, who must have worked a 14-hour day. She didn't seem to mind. As our flight out of Chile was not until the evening, we were able to meet Anibal, our travel agent, for lunch and thank him for all the excellent arrangements that he had made. It was getting dark as we crossed the Andes, but the low evening sun did illuminate some of the peaks. We were flying LAN Chile because Air France were on strike. If anything, the service was even better. At Madrid, we swapped to Iberia for the flight to London. Europe was covered in snow. Unfortunately, a couple of days after getting home, Dan fell ill and eventually suffered a stroke, ending up in hospital. How lucky we had been that this had not happened during our wonderful and exciting trip to South America.